Hello guys, how are we doing and welcome back to the channel. Today I have another spawn guide video for ranked play on Black Ops 6. Today we're focusing on red card. It's actually my last hardpoint spawn guide I'm going to do until they release a new map because it's the I've covered them all. So if you have missed any other hardpoint map for ranked play at least, and you want to know the spawns for say Skyline, you can check it out using the playlist down below or in my recent videos. And yeah, today we're focused on red card, but before we get into it, there's a couple things I want to mention. If this is your first video watching, I just want to go into a little bit of intro of what to expect. So from this video, you're going to know where the spawn points are. You're going to have an idea of how to block and manipulate the spawns. You're going to know where you spawn determines where the enemies spawn and where you spawn, what that means for the enemy's position. And I'm going to go through sort of a setup and strategy guide as well on each of the hills. If you find listening to someone on a screen on a floating head like this is a little bit hard to understand and that's not quite your learning style and you want to read through something, I do a ranked play guide which looks like this. A link for this can be found in the description. That, or you can join my Discord, which has a link in it, one of the channels as well. That, or you can always put a comment down. You can DM me on Discord, you can DM me on Twitter, and I'll likely to reply to any of those. But this rank play guide here is a way you can, anytime I put a guide on YouTube, it essentially has a written version of that guide here. You've got the contents, but it essentially looks like this. You've got the call out guide, you've got the video that you can go through, you've got the hardpoint spawn guide, and each hill has its own picture. It goes through some strategy, but you can read it as well as listen to me if you want. I also want to shout out a subscriber, a viewer called Ricardo, who donated some money to me on PayPal, which was completely unnecessary. I don't ever expect it, but I just thought, you know what, take your time out and do that as a little donation, deserves some sort of thanks. So I thought I'd do that in today's video. So appreciate you, Ricardo, for that. Much appreciated as per usual. So for those of you, as I say, who are new to this season, to this series, obviously you're going to want to check out the others, but we're going to be going into a bit of an introduction here quickly. So as I say, we go through the strategy, we go through scenarios, we go through ways you can manipulate spawns, and each sort of guide looks similar to this. So you've got the current hill in bright green, you've got the next hill a little bit more of a dim green, you've got circles which are locations of spawns, and then within each spawn you've got like a call out. So to save you saying teal or blue, you can say bus spawn, garage spawn, P5 spawn, for example. On another sort of hill, I haven't got it quite on this one, but let's say if we skip ahead a little bit, you'll find there's shaded zones like this, which are suggested areas where you can block that color spawn from. So say, for example, if you sit on these cars or on this plant here, on this bush, you'll be able to block this blue spawn by being in these blue areas, okay? It's a little bit more technical than that, but that's generally, they're an idea of where you can sit to block that specific spawn. So we're going to actually kick it off with P1 here. Obviously, if you have any questions, you can leave it down in the comments below and I will answer or at least read each comment. But the two main spawns you'll find here are pink and blue, which find themselves in the trophy room and in the garage. Blue often remains the regular spawn for the team on this side of the map, but because of how close pink is to the middle, the other two of these spawns usually get used on this side, okay? Because of how, and the reason for that is pink is so close to P1, all it takes is an enemy to get even slightly out of P1 and it blocks the spawn because of how close it becomes. Now, again, similar to most hills on this entire game, the next person to spawn will spawn at the furthest possible point away from the enemy team. Whether that means they flip, whether that means they stay on that side, that's the logic, okay? So I'll repeat that again. The next person to spawn in will spawn at the furthest point from their enemy team. That's the logic. Now, the other four spawns, so these alternative spawns here, open up when the players on the enemy team or the players on any team are closer to the two primary spawns than any of these two, okay? So two main spawns are these, and then the other alternative spawns are the smaller and different colored circles. Now, blocking is relatively simple here, because in order to block a spawn, as I said, you need to simply be closer to one spawn point than any other spawn point, than one other spawn point, okay? And that simply means the enemy won't spawn there because you're closer to that than one other, so they'll just use the other one as the option for the enemy to spawn in, okay? So let's say all you want to do is make sure the enemy can't flip spawn. So for me, I personally prefer this pink spawn because of how close it is to P2. We'll get into a little bit more strategy on this next later on. But generally speaking, I prefer this pink spawn here because of how close it is to P2. Other than that, they're pretty much the same. But it just makes it really easy to rotate to the new hill. But let's say all you want to do is make sure the enemy can't flip to pink spawns, okay? You'd have to ensure that nobody is pushed further out of this red ring. So essentially, you would make sure you have to have someone within this red zone here. So out of these walls is not out in the zone. So within this red zone here, and you would need to make sure that nobody is pushed up further than this red line. Okay, so you need someone in this red zone. So like, you know, back here, you could be this side of P1. They could be in the trophy room itself. They could be top red. They could be all the way back here if they really wanted to, but that's pretty useless. And you'd need to make sure that nobody's pushed up along this side of this side of this thing. So what that would mean is the enemy simply flips, okay? And that's the super easiest way to do it. Have someone in this zone and make sure none of your teammates are pushed up past this zone. That's all you need to remember. And that makes it really simple, and you won't flip if you do that. But obviously what can happen when you play with randoms is people push a little bit further around, and obviously the further someone pushes up towards this spawn, the closer you have to be to these spawns in order to block them. That's how it sort of works. And being in this position and having no one over this would essentially mean you've got someone closer to your diner spawns, as well as this and this spawn, than they do to this garage spawn, which means the enemy will simply spawn garage every single time. But let's say you have someone who's a little bit more aggressive on your team when they want to get close to the spawn and they're pushed up, as essentially they want to push up to this orange line, okay? They can't go past it, but they want to push up to this orange line. They want to get in tickets. They want to be on this hedge here or this side of P1. You would then need someone even further back into this spawn here. You'd need someone pushed up into, you know, maybe bottom flowers in this zone here, back trophy. You literally need someone manually blocking spawn, which means they're almost out of the play at that point, which makes them pretty much useless. So I much prefer the other one. But if you did have someone who pushed up quite a little bit far and they were on this orange line or pushed up to this orange line, you'd need to make sure someone was in this orange ring for yourself. Otherwise, it will lead to a flip. So some scenarios here. If you spawn garage, it simply means the enemy have full control of the trophy area of the map, okay? And that's simply all it means. Now, if you spawn at either of these teal spawns, so whether bus or P5, it means the enemy has control of the trophy area and they're pushed up towards the other teal spawns. So say, for example, you spawn P5, it tends to mean the enemy team has control of this side of the map, but they're pushed around the right-hand side slightly here, which means that you've spawned in here instead of here. You've been bumped back a little bit from this enemy who's pushed around this side of the map. Now, if you spawn pink, it doesn't happen very often, and it basically means that the enemies are pretty much all sat in spawn. They're all coming off spawn. Potentially, you've just got four kills, and the team's completely wiped, but it doesn't happen often, and it means the enemy pretty much haven't moved from their spawn. Now, if you spawn diner, it means the enemy have garage side controlled, but they're pushed up towards hedges or P1, close enough to these two spawns to make you spawn back here. And that's typically where you'll find yourself spawning if you are this side of the map, because of how easy it is to be closer to these two spawns than it is this one. Now, if you spawn P2, this is a bit of a bizarre one. I'm not sure. I've seen it happen a couple of times when I've been reviewing these spawns. But all that essentially means is that the enemy team have got control of this area of the map, but they've also pushed around P5 a bit. They've pushed into diner. Potentially, they're looking to flip. So just be very careful. If you ever spawn P2, just look to your left, because it essentially means someone's trying to get behind you and potentially fit the spawns for the new hill. Now, strategy-wise, as I say, I really much prefer these pink spawns because of how close they are to P2 itself. And you really want to try and get these pink spawns as early as you can, just to save you having to rotate later into the hill and stressing about it too much. Now, you can do that by flanking through P2 itself, or going through P5, which is probably my preferred route because it blocks this. It's easier, and it's probably a little bit, you're less likely to get caught going this way than you are around that way, because that's the new objective. You need to ensure that nobody in your team is in garage when you do pinch and flip the spawn, because otherwise the enemy simply won't flip. They'll just spawn at one of these two alternative locations, depending on how far around you are pushed. So they'll either spawn here if you're here, or when you do get around and your enemies are still here, they'll literally spawn here. So you've got to be careful that when you do go around and you do try and flip these spawns, that the enemy, your teammates, are completely out of this zone. Otherwise the enemy simply won't flip. But then once you do get the pink spawns, you then need to make sure that your team aren't pushed up too much, and you should be good, ready for a setup at P2. So moving on to P2 here, the main spawns again are blue, which is in trophy room, and pink, which is near the police car. You also have yellow, which is in hedge or H3, if you want to be really specific, teal, which is CAF, and then red, which is in diner. And those three, yellow, red, and teal, are the alternative spawns that will be used when these two spawns are blocked or there's an enemy too close to those two spawns to use. Now, the same logic applies here. The next person to spawn in will spawn at the furthest possible spawn point to their opponent. Okay? So, blocking spawns obviously depends on how far your team are pushed up. The farther they're pushed up towards these three spawns, the closer you'll have to be to your spawns to stop the block. To stop the enemy from flipping, okay? So prefer, as I say, I'm going to sneak you into a little bit of strategy here. I prefer to have these pink spawns because of how close it is to the next hill. Overall, for P2 itself, they're both fairly 50-50. I don't mind either spawn for this hill itself. I do potentially prefer this because of the route to P2 itself and how much you can see of P2 from this side. That and the fact it's really close to P3 makes me really want these spawns, okay? So if you wanted to block the enemy from spawning here, some areas you can block the pink spawn from could be on this hedge here, it could be on the camera van, on the camera stand thing, you could be on the stage itself, and that'll pretty much be close enough to this pink spawn to block it. Now, obviously, if your team does really get super aggressive and they're pretty much on one of these spawn points, you then need to be pretty much on your 2 spawn points to stop them from flipping. On the flip side of that, if you did prefer these blue spawns for whatever reason, potential areas you could block that spawn from could be flowers or the top red window, for example. Now, if you want to remember one thing, it's this. If there's one thing you want to take away from P2 in this video, is that once you have pink spawns, all you need to do is make sure one person stays within this orange zone around this yellow and pink spawn, and nobody gets into this orange ring around Dino spawn. Okay, so if you make sure none of your team pushes into this orange zone and you have one person in this zone, you will never flip. It's as simple and as logical as that. You will never flip, because what that means is nobody is closer to Dino than they are closer to these 2 spawns, okay? You'll always have someone closer on your team to these 2 spawns than you do Dino, which means, you know what, the enemy can push as far, your teammates can push as far around as P2 as they want. They can even push deep into here, but as long as you've got someone here, they'll just spawn Dino, okay? It's that simple, and it's really easy to trap them in, and it's another reason why I prefer these pink spawns, because of how easy it is to trap them into that Dino spawn. Now, let's take some scenarios here, okay? So if you spawn pink, if I'm looking over to my left, by the way, I've got all my notes, which are going to be going into the document. So I've only just looked at this. It takes a couple of hours, so I'm just reading it as we go through. If you spawn pink, it essentially means the enemies aren't much out of their spawn, but have control of the trophy area of the map. If you spawn yellow, it essentially means the enemy have the trophy area of the map covered, and they've pushed around to the right-hand side of P2, blocking this pink spawn. Okay, so they've pushed a little bit too close to the right here, and it means that instead of spawning here, you've spawned a little bit further out, and you're now spawned up there. Now, if you spawn trophy, it just means the enemy are pushed up out. The enemy hasn't pushed up out of their spawn much at all, but they've got control of this top area up here, towards police, towards hedges, that area they've got control of. Now, if you spawn Dino, enemy has control of the police or the street area here, and are pushed up through P2, and they could perhaps be in dark. They could even be up towards cafe, as long as they're blocking this, as we've said a minute ago. Now, if you spawn cafe, this is a really interesting one. If you spawn cafe, it means the enemy has control of the police and street area, and are pushed through tickets and flowers, and they're closer to these spawns essentially than they are here. So if you find yourself spawned here, chances are there's someone pushed up through middle, there's someone maybe in your trophy room, so just be very careful that they're here and here, so that you've just got, you can communicate that to your team, and essentially it means you're in the shit, okay? Now, some strategy-wise here, as I say, you're going to really want to try and fight for these pink spawns, because they are, I would say, objectively the better side. Obviously, it's up to anyone, but it's close to P2, it's close to P2, it's close to P3, it's easy to get trapped on the other spawn, so that's simply the one I prefer. Now, you can get these spawns by running through tickets if you want to take a little bit of a route. If you spawn here, you can run through tickets to flip, you can flank through middle, or winning some tough gunfights through P2 and then pushing through P2, releasing these spawns completely. That will spawn them out and means that, they then have the bad spawns and you have the good spawns. Now, once you have yellow and pink spawns, you essentially just want to try and dedicate a couple of players around hedges, or at least have one player in this orange zone, ensure nobody pushes into this orange zone, and you've got it covered, okay? They'll spawn Dino, you can be pushed up to Calf, you can be pushed up to Dark, you have someone hill, and then someone here. You've got this whole control of this zone here. Essentially, it means they'll run out of Dino, they'll either come through trophy, they'll come top window, they might come through middle, so just be very careful. They'll spawn Dino, yes, they've got a lot of routes out of it, so make sure you've got well-covered areas and you communicate to your team effectively to make sure that when they run out of a certain door, you've got that comm and you know which areas you're watching. And then when it gets to obviously the end of P3, end of P2, sorry, and it starts to get to P3, if you are at Calf, if you are at Dark, maybe pull back a little bit and start to rotate to P3, ready to set up in the new hill. So P3 is relatively simple. Okay, this probably is the simplest one in all of Red Card. The main two spawns here are blue, which is in the vending area, and pink, which is street, police, whatever you want to call it. The alternative spawns are teal, which is near this blue SUV, and yellow, which is P1. Okay, and again, whoever respawns next will spawn at the furthest point from an enemy player. Okay, from their enemy player. So blocking spawns obviously depends on how far your team are pushed up, and the further you're pushed up towards the enemy spawn, the further someone on your team also has to be pushed back towards your own spawn. Otherwise, it will cause a flip. Now, again, I much prefer to have these pink spawns here because of how easy it is to trap the enemy into this vending machine garage area. Okay, it's a horrible trap, and essentially this spawn is also very close to P4, as you'll notice. If the enemy spawn in blue, as I say, which is what you want the player on P3 to be the furthest pushed into garage. You want to try and avoid anyone pushing garage because it will essentially lead to a flip. So the person on P3 is the person who should be the furthest into the garage than anyone else on your team. Now, whilst you have someone on the hill, you can have someone pushed into tickets or P1 doors, blocking this spawn. You can have someone on the bus or street, watching and like blocking this spawn, and you can have someone pushed up the street a little bit here, just watching. If anyone decides to spawn vended and go street, this person here can then look at that and make sure they can't flank around P3. And that'll essentially mean they're trapped in this little zone here, and the only three options they have is push Eskies, but someone here will pick that up, push the hill, the person on the hill will pick that up, or push left street, the person on the street will pick that up. Okay, that's the simplest way. You can then have one person, you can dedicate one person to playing between those 3 points, but as long as nobody pushes garage, you should be fine. You shouldn't flip unless you've left these spawns completely open. Okay, the only way you'll flip if you've got these pink spawns, even if you don't push garage, you need to make sure that you're not, you've got someone relatively close to this pink spawn, maybe on the bus or something like that, watching this right hand side. Otherwise, it will flip. So just be very careful. Okay. So let's take some scenarios here. If you spawn blue, it simply means the enemy has more control of the street and middle of the map than they do garage. Super simple. If you spawn teal, it means the enemy has perhaps just spawned garage. So they've got garage spawns or they've got garage control. And they also have people around P1 and P4. Okay, otherwise you'd have spawned at one of these two. If you spawn pink, it simply means the enemy has good control of garage and they're likely to have spawned, and you've likely to spawn with your teammates there. If you spawn pink, chances are that's just your main spawn. But the enemies will be garage area if you spawn there. Now, if you spawn yellow, it typically means the enemy has garage control and they're pushed up the street a little. So they've got out of garage and they're pushed up this left-hand side there, stopping you from block spawning here, and therefore you spawned here. Okay, so that just gives you all the information you should know depending on where you're spawning. And it's why it's so important to have your enemy or your teammates say, "I've just spawned here," because that tells you exactly what you need to know as to where they're on the enemy's position. Now, as I say, strategy-wise, I very much like to have the pink spawns because of how close it is to P4 and how easy it is to pin the enemies into the blue spawn in vending machine in garage. So you really want to fight for it, okay? Once you do have these pink spawns, the important thing to remember is that the person on P3, as I say before, has to be the person closest pushed up into garage. As I say, you can have someone in hill, then you can have someone P1 doors, you can have someone street. And that, as long as you've got this area of the map covered as well as someone at P3, and you're just watching the exits out of the vending spawn, you should be gravy. Okay, you've got to win gunfights, but obviously that's just COD. If you can't win gunfights, you're never going to win anyways. So you do have to win gunfights to get to these areas and to get proper setups. But the person winning the gunfights is probably the better team anyway. But it's important to know this so you know how to manipulate the enemy spawns. When it gets to the end of P3, obviously you want to pull back your defense a little bit more, push towards P4 and get ready to set up for P4. But little sneak peek, you're going to want these spawns here for P4 as well. Now, the main two spawns here, as I say, are pink and blue. One resides just around P2 dark area here, and one resides in street. The alternative spawns are yellow, which is in trophy room or flowers, and then teal, which is around the pillar. These are used when the enemy gets a bit too close to your primary spawns, and then the game uses your secondary spawns when that happens. Now, in order to block a specific spawn, you just have to be closer to that spawn than anywhere else your team is pushed up to. And so, if you imagine a diagonal line going from P4 to P5, you really want to try and stay on your side of that diagonal line. So, if you spawn pink, you don't want to cross this middle line. If you spawn blue, you really don't want to cross that middle line because otherwise you'll flip. Okay. And as long as you stay your side of that line that goes across this middle map, you should be fine and you should not flip. Now, if you want to remember one thing, personally, I think I prefer these pink spawns, but because of how symmetrical this map is, I don't really mind it. But I'm going to assume that these pink spawns are the ones I want here, okay? If you want to remember one thing on the hill and you want these right-hand spawns, you need to make sure that, one, you've got someone in this orange zone your side, and two, you don't have anyone pushed up further than this orange line, okay? If you push up further than this orange line, it might mean you're further from one of these spawns than you are to these, and it might mean a flip, okay? So just be very careful about that. Realistically, I guess if you pushed up a little bit towards Blue Street, that should be fine as long as you're not pushed really close to this pillar spawn. Depending on as long as you don't have someone pushed up the P1 as well. But let's take, say you want, let's flip this around, okay? Let's assume you want the blue spawns, because as I say, it's 50-50. Blue spawn, pink spawn. I'm not really sure what's the better one at this point. But let's take this the other side around in case you are, you do prefer these blue spawns. Essentially, you could push up. You'd have to do one thing. You'd have to make sure someone is in this orange zone at all times, blocking these spawns, and you need to make sure that nobody's pushed up past this orange line. Following that, you should be absolutely gravy. You're not going to flip, and you can pretty much trap the enemy into one of these two spawns, okay? So scenario-wise, if you spawn blue or pink, it simply means the enemy has control of the other side of the map, but not enough control so that you've spawned out towards your alternative spawn, okay? Now, if you do spawn at your alternative spawn, whether it's from pink to yellow or blue to teal, it essentially means the enemy has control of the other side of the map still, but they're pushed up slightly towards your primary spawn. Now, if you flip and you spawn the enemies and you spawn at the enemy side of the map, it essentially means they've left their spawn enough and pushed your spawn enough to cause that flip. Okay, so they're closer to one of your two spawns, or they're closer to both your spawns, and far enough away from one of theirs to result in that flip. All right. Now, as I say, I do prefer to have these pink spawns, and from what I've said so far, the strategy here should be quite simple. You do not want to flip. So let's take this example. Let's say, I want these blue spawns. You'd need someone in this orange zone, so it could be on this hedge here, for example, and you'd need to make sure nobody's pushed up to this, or past this orange line. That'll keep the spawns predictable, and it won't lead the flip. The biggest thing that happens is when, say, oh, I've been pinched, or oh, the spawn behind me, and that often causes a loss in gunfights. It makes things unpredictable, and the only way to make it predictable is to make sure you're following these rules here. You need someone in this orange zone. You need someone, and you can't have anyone pushing up here. Okay, now that's when you're solo queuing or duo queuing or trio queuing. You might have one rogue player who simply loves to just run it down. But knowing this information, knowing they've crossed this line, but you don't have anyone here, is great information to have, because it means they're simply going to flip, and it means you can then at least read the flip. Okay. Moving on to P5, the final hill of this map. Again, the two primary spawns here are pink, which is Diner, and blue, which is L, and the alternative spawns are Garage, which is teal, and Trophy Room, which is yellow. And these are used essentially when the enemy's pushed a little bit too close to these other two primary spawns to spawn there, and as a result, you've spawned out. Say you spawned from L to Garage, for example, because the pink team have pushed a little bit far through P5. Now, you notice two other spawn points here, red. These are used when every single other spawn is blocked, and they've got a little bit more control of the other side. So if you spawn, we'll get into the scenarios in a second, but let's say you spawn pillar, it essentially means the enemies are around this area, they're around this area, but they're a little bit pushed out towards middle as well, otherwise you spawn flowers. Okay, so that's just the safest spawn for you to spawn in. Now, in order to block a specific spawn, again, you just have to be close to that spawn, then anyone else on your team is pushed up to their spawn, the enemy spawn. Okay, now if you imagine a diagonal line here between P5 and P1, you want to try and stay your side for best results. But we're going to go through a way on how you can get a little bit more aggressive on P5 than you could have on P4. So, as I say, if you want to try and remember one single thing, it's this. Okay, now I personally, depends. It's completely up. These sides are interchangeable, but I prefer this pink spawn because of how easy it is to trap the enemy in Garage. Okay, it's a really horrible spawn trap if you find yourself spawning there. If you've ever been in that trap before, it's horrendous. Okay, so I prefer these pink spawns because I simply hate being in that trap. Okay, it's that simple. A super easy way to make sure the enemy doesn't spawn behind you. Okay, you can push up, and as I say, this is one thing. If you want to remember anything about P5 on this map, you can push up to the enemy's orange line. So whether you push up to this from pink or whether you push up to this from blue, and as long as you have somebody within your orange line. So let's say we want the pink side spawn. We've got this spawn here. You can have people pushed all the way up to this camera thing, this camera tower. You can have someone pushed up into the upper balcony here slightly, and just their side of P5, as long as you have someone within this orange zone your side. So you could have someone sat on the VIP seats here. Now, again, we'll flip that around. Let's say you've got these spawns. You can have people pushed up all the way this side of P5. There isn't much cover here. It's not great, but you can have people pushed up all the way up here, so long as you have someone within your own orange zone. Okay, so that might mean they're in this little shortcut here. They're like, you know, just up the top of the stairs at L, looking over this heady. But yeah, essentially you can push up to the enemy's orange line, up to, not over, as long as you're within your own orange area. So let's take some scenarios here. Now, if you find yourself spawning blue or pink, it simply means the enemy has control of the other side of the map, but they're not too pushed up. Okay, so you've got a safe spawn still, even though it's the closest spawn to them. Now, if you spawn at either alternative spawn, it means the enemy has control of the other side. So let's say we spawn at this alternative spawn. It means the enemy's got the other side controlled, but they're pushed a little bit through P5, or they're pushed a little bit too close to the hill so that you can't spawn L. Now, if you flip to the enemy's alternative spawn, it essentially means the enemy has control of the other side of the map, but has also got slightly control of their primary spawn area. Okay. Again, all of this will be in writing if you ever want to look through it again. Now, if you spawn at either red spawn, we touched on this a minute ago, but if you spawn at either one of these red spawns, it means the enemy is on every other spawn point and is closer to the other red spawn than the one you spawned at. Okay, so let's say you spawn flowers, it means they're here and here. They're in garage, and they're probably also around this pillar zone as well. They're in this shortcut here, meaning that this flower spawn is the most open spawn usable for the game. Now, it essentially means the enemy's everywhere, so just be very careful if you spawn at one of those red spawns, okay? Now, personally, as I say, I prefer to have the pink spawn because of how easy it is to get to P5. There's a lot of cover, and how much you can trap them into that garage spawn. But it's completely personal preference, okay? Essentially, all you need to do with whatever spawn you have is ensure someone is pulled back enough into your orange ring and nobody's pushed forward enough over their orange ring. And it's that simple. That will stop it from flipping. It will keep it readable. And it's super simple. Now, from a pink side, what I love to do, a setup I like to employ, is I can have someone VIP steps here where this red zone is. They're still in this circle, as you can see. VIP, and they can pretty much look over the whole map. But what they're doing there, more importantly, is blocking these two spawns. You can then have someone pushed up to the enemy's camera. You can have someone then pushed up to tickets, looking at their push out of garage eskies. And it essentially means they're trapped in this garage here. They can't get up out of L because the player camera will see them. They can't come out of garage for eskies because it means that the person tickets can see them. It forces them to take a really long route round, which means that they're less likely to get P5 time. And that's that. That's red card, hardpoint. It's a lot easier to understand than I think people give it credit for. And it's just making sure if there's one thing you take, just be close, just have the spawn guides ready, have the spawn points available on a second screen, on a tablet, on your phone, ready to look at when the new spawn happens, when a new hill happens, sorry, and just make sure that one of those spawns, whatever spawn you want the enemy to spawn at, is further from any of your team than they are to the other spawns. That's the only thing you need to remember, pretty much for any map on this game. So I hope you enjoyed the guide. If there's anything else you want me to cover, or there's any questions, as I say, you can leave it down in the comments. You can DM me on Twitter or Discord. Both links are down in the description below, and I will see you in the next video. Ciao for now.